Is this working? Yes. So good morning and welcome back for this second day for this session entitled Death and Migration in Times of Conflict, a Forensic Perspective. Panel 4, the Thanatic Politics of Burial. So I am Karim Danoun from the University of Montpellier 3. And I'm not Carolina Kobelinsky, who couldn't make it on time, so I will be chairing this panel for you today, for this morning. So we have many guests. I will begin. So Professor Alan Rice will begin this session. Then Inès and there's only one name, Inès and Louise. Will follow, and Arkadi and Christel on final position. So I will first introduce Alan Rice, who is Professor of English and American Studies at UC LAN, Preston, co-director of UC LAN RKA Institute for Area and Migration Studies, director of UC LAN Research Center on Migration, Diaspora, and Exile, and co-director of Institute for Black Atlantic Research. He has published Radical Narratives of the Black Atlantic in 2003, Creating Memorials, Building Identities, The Politics of Memory in the Black Atlantic in 2010, and Inside the Invisible, Memorializing Slavery and Freedom in the Life and Works of Lubaina Hamid. So that was in 2019. In 2021, he curated the exhibition Lubaina Hamid Memorial to Zong. Most recently, in 2023, together with Lancaster Black History Group and Facing the Past, he has rolled out his Lancaster Slave Trade, Abolition and Fair Trade Tour to new audiences and written the catalog Facing the Past, Black Lancastrians for Leila Harris's exhibition. And last year, with Preston Black History Group, he organized landmark commemorations for the 80th anniversary for the Battle of Bamber Bridge. And his talk today is entitled African American Mutiny, Riot and Death in the Lancashire Village, the Strange and Inspiring Battle of Bamber Bridge and its Commemoration. So let me switch to the PowerPoint.
Great, thanks for that introduction. Just wait for my slides to be loaded, that's great. If you were in Britain, tomorrow night would be a landmark day for all of you, because you would turn on Channel 4 at 8:20, and I will be a talking head and consultant on a documentary called Churchill, Britain's Secret Apartheid, which is quite strange for me because I only learnt the title 2 days ago. And actually, it's really about the Battle of Bamber Bridge, or that's the main story. But I think they're wanting to tickle the beast of the woke, anti-woke generation by mentioning Churchill and up their ratings by a bit. When it's in America, it's going to be called Black GIs and Jim Crow or something, so it'll have the better title. I don't think. I mean, Churchill was responsible for agreeing to Jim Crow in Britain, and it is important we talk about that. But I want to talk about the lives of the black soldiers. Okay. Can I advance this? Am I doing this wrong? Yeah, that's it. That's great. Yeah, that's the one. Sorry. There was a lot of chatter about it. Obviously, it was named the Battle of Bamber Bridge. Never in my life did I think that 80 years later it would be resurrected. This is Eunice Byers. Here she is at 97, at the 70th anniversary. She lasted till the 80th anniversary and was being interviewed right up to her death at 107, just before the 81st anniversary this year. On the morning of 24th of June 2023, the residents of Bamber Bridge woke up to a hive of activity around the Old Hob Inn. The erection of a stage, the arrival of military vehicles, the practicing of Lindy hoppers, etc., etc. It's part of the commemorations for the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Bamber Bridge. However, it was with much quieter and smaller commemoration that I want to begin this introduction. On the corner of Station Road and Cooperative Street in the small village of Bamber Bridge, just outside Lancaster. Oh, that's okay, great. A memorial appeared, what I would call a guerrilla memorial, one that's not officially sanctioned or commissioned and is often small and personalised. There was one of two memorials put out on the night of the 80th, night before the 80th anniversary, so it would be there in the morning. It was a commonplace jam jar with flowers and a simple cross with an American flag and the number 80. The text read, "Here fell Private William Crossland, 15th 11th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, US Army, during the Battle of Bamber Bridge, 24th of June, 1943. Now you might think, battle, Bamber Bridge, Second World War. I didn't think the Germans got to Britain. Well, actually, of course they didn't. The battle was between the American military police and the black troops because they were trying to impose Jim Crow segregation on the streets of Britain. Private William Crossland was the only person to die in the conflict. He was just 25 and a former railroad worker who had joined the fight against fascism and ended up dying in an alleged crossfire on the streets of a small Lancashire village. During that awful night, over 400 shots were fired, and still today there are bullet holes as distinctive memorials in walls close to the army camp. And in fact, the chair of Lancaster Black History Group, Clinton Smith, first heard about the Battle of Bamber Bridge when he was a painter and decorator, and looked up at the bank in Bamber Bridge and saw large holes. And he said to his companion, "You have lots of termites here?" And they said, "No, those are the bullet holes from the Battle of Bamber Bridge." And he said then, was that a conflict when Bonnie Prince Charlie came south? There was a battle near Preston, musket fire. He said, "No, look at the bullets. They're smaller than that." And they were smaller than that. And the bullets came from the Second World War. For me, the Jam Jar Memorial shows that the ordinary residents of the village were focused on the horrors of that night's event and the tragic consequences for the ordinary soldiers to whom they'd given such a warm welcome. Private William Crossland had been shot down on their streets and was to die a couple of days later. They felt his sacrifice for justice should not be forgotten. And we had around 500 participants on the Memorial Day commemorations, and many of them came across the memorials over the course of the commemorative weekend. I, in fact, added its location to my battlefield tour. I did 2 battlefield tours that weekend, one on the Saturday. And there were 200 people on my battlefield tour. I've never done a tour like it, with members of the local community shouting out to me added facts as I arranged the tour. No, my grandma said it didn't happen like that. Sorry, I can't. I would do a Lancashire accent, but I can't. So you have to have it in vernacular. Well, get Sid up and he can do the Lancashire accent soon. Anyway, so, that tour was just an incredible experience. I've done slave site tours for years. Probably the maximum has been 50, and they didn't give me a megaphone. So I was shouting the odds as we toured around, showing where the battle took place. We've had a poignant reminder, this memorial, of why many of us have fought for years for due recognition of the importance of this event, to the struggle of this event, telling the story of African-American troops in Britain, and of course all over Europe, their contributions to the struggle against fascism, and their fight for racial justice against Jim Crow segregation, which the American military authorities tried to impose in British localities in an utterly misguided attempt to uphold military discipline. What the American military authorities, with the connivance of the British military authorities, were trying to do was to stop fraternisation. Fraternisation happened anyway. And not only did fraternisation happen, but the people in Bamber Bridge and many other places throughout Britain gaily welcomed the fraternisation. And as they were saying, they said things like, God, it was so boring till the black American troops came out. Then they taught us a jitterbug, and I was bugging like crazy. And what also is happening again and again is actually they are getting welcomed as defenders against fascism. And no one understands why the racism is coming to them, why they are being discriminated against in Britain. And what happens is we have troops from Alabama walking the streets and walking into the gutter when they approach white people. And the white civilians in Bamber Bridge saying to them, you don't have to do that anymore. You're not in America now. And then welcoming them into their homes. Anyway. Only one building remains of the barracks where the black troops stayed. And quite close to here are many of the bullet holes, and you can still see them today. And we're looking to try and get archaeologists onto the trail of these bullet holes, just to make sure that they're not just stray fire from someone's air pistol, but there's so many of them, they're not. So we now have a memorial. And the memorial is to the Battle of Bamber Bridge. And the memorial is outside. It's a gardens with this plaque. I wrote most of the text on the plaque. And it's just outside the Old Hob Inn. And the Old Hob Inn is where it all kicked off that night. What happened was the American military police were getting increasingly upset at the fraternisation. And they came into the pub that night to make arrests. And they tried to make an arrest of someone for wearing incorrect military uniform off base. The soldiers fought back. The British civilians and the British troops in the pub fought back against the American military police so hard they couldn't make the arrest. One British British soldier, was heard to exclaim, "They've done nothing wrong. What are you doing arresting them?" Earlier that evening, the barmaid in that bar had refused to serve some white American soldiers who'd come in before the black soldiers. They pushed to the front. She said, "You're in Britain now. We queue here. You get to the back." This is a concerted effort of these British civilians to say Jim Crow does not happen in Britain. So here they are. We are at 70th anniversary. I'm just about to do my tour outside the Old Hob Inn. So we have been commemorating now for about 15 years here. At our special commemoration of the event in Bamber Bridge, Aaron Snipes, spokesperson for the US Embassy, said, "As an American living in the UK, there's a British virtue that I admire greatly, that I have noticed and noted since I arrived here, and that is reverence for history, a strong burning desire to remember the past, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. I've had a chance to visit other parts of the country. I was in Sheffield not long ago attending a memorial for 10 American airmen who died 79 years ago. Here in Bamber Bridge, because William Crossan died on the streets of Bamber Bridge 80 years ago today, and we're remembering him. You all in this town are remembering him, as if it happened a lot closer in time. So that speaks to the values of Britain. Snipe's eloquent words speak to the way local events have global significance, and I believe that the Battle of Bamber Bridge is such an event. And the African-American troops in 1511 fraternised with the white English locals in ways that would have been impossible in many parts of the United States at the time. They invited them into their churches. Over the weekend, anecdotes were told about how at first, when they arrived in Bamber Bridge, they were shocked by the welcome they got. They were shocked by the ways in which they were invited into people's homes and worried about going into those white people's homes at first. Receiving this respect in Lancashire, they're following in a long tradition of black visitors to Lancashire. The actor Ira Aldridge got his best reviews in Lancashire. Frederick Douglass, when he came, talked continually about what an amazing welcome he was getting in Lancashire. And of course, during the Lancashire cotton famine in the 1860s, it was the Lancashire cotton workers who stood up and sent a letter to Lincoln, despite their economic interest being in the South winning, saying, "We hope that you win this war." And Lincoln sent them flour because they were all suffering from the cotton embargo. So this is a long-lasting transatlantic solidarity. These people, the Briggers, the people from Bamber Bridge, not only opposed the attempted imposition of Jim Crow segregation in their community, but kept the memory of that fight for justice alive for 80 years. This is so important because the official written record of the battle through the court-martial records is insulting to the memory of a fight for justice, instead demonising the African-American troops as being thoughtless hooligans and actually dismissing key evidence. The summary record from 10th of February discusses what happened, and this happened after the shooting. So they went from the Old Hob Inn after it all died down and walked along the street, and then the American military police came back with reinforcements. And in the struggle, two unarmed black troops were shot, one in the back and one in the back of the neck. And then they actually fought off the military police again, the black troops, and they said, we'll come back with more reinforcements. And then they helped their colleagues back to base. Once they got back to base, the black troops didn't have access to weapons. They were support troops, but they raided the armory and got weapons to defend themselves against the military police. The military police arrived about 20 minutes later with a machine gun emplacement on top of an American military vehicle to try and take back the base. And then the firefight happened all over the town for the next 4 hours. It's incredible. Only one soldier died. Anyway, I'll carry on. The court-martial record said the grievance of the coloured soldiers arising out of alleged unfair and persecutory treatment of them by the military police. There also arose among them, this is the court-martial transcript, disjointed and desultory talk concerning the social and political status of the Negro race in the United States and of certain discriminations practiced in the United Kingdom against coloured American soldiers alleged to have been inspired by white American troops. Here, in a nutshell, is the reason for the mutinous behaviour. Racial prejudice travelling with the American army like a nasty disease, but it's dismissed as disjointed and desultory talk. Not taking it seriously as a cause of the battle enables them to see it as indiscipline. The language used to describe such behaviour is telling. The report talks of how the troops are a mob determined on revenge at any cost, and that the soldiers become excited and a degree of hysteria swept through the post, and how among certain groups there was an exhibition of mob psychology, it says, which donated fear approaching a frenzy. The word hysteria is used often. The use of word hysteria is used often in the report as shorthand for the out of control, so-called out of control African American soldiers. They are out of control. They're out of the control of the American military establishment, which is establishing Jim Crow against them. Such a denotation of out of control cannot account for the actual events on the ground, where there's a cold logic and a humanitarian nature shown by these mutineers. Locals are advised by them to stay inside. "You better get inside, boss," one of them says. "There's going to be plenty of shooting." Even more telling in terms of rejecting the description of the behaviour as hysterical is an interaction with a white lieutenant, which is actually detailed in the absolutely biased court-martial records. At about 11 a.m, as he turned from Station Road into Mountsie Street, Lieutenant Ossett heard a couple of shots. He stopped, parked his car. This is a white American military officer. Someone shouted, "Cut the lights off on the motor." He complied, waited about 5 minutes, and then attempted to drive around the truck. There was further shots, and he stopped. One shot went through the windshield of his car. He then received 3 bullets in his left leg and 2 in his right leg as he sat in the car. When the shooting ceased, a voice called, "Come out with your hands up." Lieutenant Ossett struggled out of the car and went to the rear of it. There were about 30 men about. Someone said, "This is Lieutenant Ossett." When the officer said he was wounded, a soldier came to him, entered the car and took the wheel. A second soldier assisted Lieutenant Ossett into the vehicle. They went through the camp gate with permission of the guard, driving first to the officer's quarter and then to the dispensary. The characterisation of hysteria is not borne out by such an incident, where the troops help out an injured member of the officer class. Far from being out of control, the men show restraint and humanity in a highly charged situation. However, the judgment of the court-martial had more weight, and sentences ranging from 1 to 10 years were handed out to 29 of the men for mutiny, riot, and unlawful possession of weapons. Although most were discharged within 15 months because of a shortage of troops for the war effort, their convictions scarred the men greatly. As filmmaker Gregory Cook told Lauren Fryer in a national public radio broadcast in June 2023. Having managed to contact an elderly black veteran in Colorado, Cook describes how he refused to talk to me about it. Our conversation lasted all of 2 minutes. If he was court-martialed, it's not something that he would come back and voluntarily talk about. I got in touch with him about maybe 60 years later. It was probably like opening a wound for him. The shame of being on such serious charges held against a veteran meant there has been ongoing silence about the Battle of Bamber Bridge in the USA. Virtually no one talks about it there. Events like last year's commemoration are counteracting this. In the wake of media publicity, Nancy Crosland-Adkins, a niece of William Crosland, outlined to the Associated Press how she was never told the circumstances of her uncle's death. The stigma of association with the mutiny might have been a motivation behind the family changing the spelling of their name to Crosland with 1 S. She added, "Having dealt with direct discrimination myself by integrating the school system in North Carolina and the racial injustice that my parents faced, I would love an investigation. And the call is for an investigation. The call is for a pardon." And she came back to Bamber Bridge in July just this year, and also came to Cambridge to visit the gravesite of her of her uncle. It's just an incredible moment when she came to Bamber Bridge. There were witnesses to greet her in the pub. We gave her a standing ovation, and we had a brilliant 2 hours with her. And it was her first time coming back. To call to reopen the case, just 2 paragraphs, to reopen the case or exonerate the GIs was echoed in Bamber Bridge in 2023 by many who took part in the commemoration. Keeping their memory alive has been vital to the renewed impetus for justice, however belated, for those whose lives were blighted by American racism. Just briefly to comment, Crossland is buried there as though nothing has happened, as though he is just a normal black American soldier who's died in combat. However, he is named in the court-martial as being a mutineer. So this is a real discrepancy, and one I'm going to try and find out more about in the archives next year. I've got a Fulbright professorship in Michigan, and we'll visit the archives then. Keeping their memory alive has been vital to the renewed impetus for justice, however belated, for those whose lives are blighted by American racism. The irony that this brave stand against discrimination occurred in the midst of a fight for the racist Nazi regime was not lost on the Bamber Bridge residents then. It's this story of solidarity across the racial divide that our commemorations celebrate, and which is a beacon of hope that we trust will lead to the exoneration and pardon so richly deserved by those of African American soldiers who came to Europe to fight fascism and had to fight Jim Crow racism as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So, our next speakers are Inès and Louise.
Sorry.
Inès is a PhD, so who is Inès? Inès is a PhD student at the European Center of Sociology and Political Science here in Paris at the EHESS, and at the Social Research Center on Law and Criminal Institutions at Paris-Saclay. She works on trajectories of French people in Algeria after independence and the framing of deferred repatriation by the French government under the supervision of Nicolas Mariot and Emmanuel Blanchard at Paris-Saclay and Sciences Po Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Louise is a PhD student in history at the Centre d'Histoire Sociale des Mondes Contemporains. She's related to Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. Since September 2023, she has been working on a PhD thesis under the supervision of Emmanuel Bélanger and Julien Michy, and on the involvement of working class women in the French Communist Party between the wars 1920-1939. And their talk is entitled Documenting Migration and Persecution by Marble, the case study of Jewish migrants' collective burials at the Parisian Cemetery of Bagneux from the interwar period to the present day. What was this?
Okay. Yes, thank you for inviting us to this conference and in this beautiful room. Louise and I are part of a project named Lubart World, in which we are led the survey we are going to talk about. In a nutshell, this project is led by the historian Claire Zalk. It aims to bridge the divide between historiography of the Holocaust and historiography of migration to combat what some have labeled as a tendency of to sequester the Shoah. It combines a transnational history perspective with a micro-historical methodology in order to reconstruct trajectories of each Jewish inhabitant of the Polish village of Lubartów between the early 1920s and the early 50s. In other words, it means tracing around 3,500 individuals, asking whether they emigrated or whether they were exterminated or survived the Holocaust. The key issue is to document the dynamic structuring a social group subject to a major shock, the Holocaust, by asking in particular who flees, when, where, and with whom, and by thinking altogether dynamic dynamics of migration and dynamics of persecution. And in this project, Louise and I are giving a glance at the funeral practices of Lubartovians which immigrated in the Paris region. They were gathered in societies of Jewish immigrants called Landsmannschaften, in which they plan death on a collective scale. In this presentation, we are going to show how Lubartov's collective migrants' burial vaults allow us to question death as a moment for defining and redefining social ties and affiliation, as well as gender, family, and migratory belongings. The results presented this morning were obtained on the basis of interviews with members of the association, of the consultation of private archives, of members of the association and funeral company, public archives, and observation of meetings. We also relied on an urban exploration of graves on the frontiers of Urbex. Firstly, we will underline how the Lubartovians in Paris region dealt with death in migration and what kind of solidarity they forged. And secondly, we will see how, thanks to these migration ties, these collective burial vaults become objects of documentation and commemoration in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And finally, we will discuss how these funeral practices helped to set and negotiate the boundaries of a social group.
Okay, so let's begin by taking a closer look at the funeral practices of immigrants from Lubartov in the Paris region. The starting point of our research was the knowledge of the existence of one collective grave belonging to an association named Les Amis de Lubartov. In English, it means the Friends of Lubartov. This association was a mutual aid association that took care of certain material aspects of their member lives, and among which their funerals, in order to helping them to alleviate the heavy cost of death. The purchase of these collective vaults, burial vaults, implied a collective burial of the members of a group altogether. In the Parisian Cemetery of Bagneux, in the south of Paris, there are about 100 collective graves, like the Lubartovs one, and in those graves there are 20 or 30 coffins stacked on the top of each other, with men on one side and women on the other. And this practice is quite singular, especially in France, where being buried together in one and only grave is a little-known burial practice. The graves are mostly individual, or people are buried as a couple or with relatives, sometimes with children or parents. And even though some cemeteries have eras reserved for burials of individuals from the same confessional or ethnical groups, burial vaults remain individuals of our families. So this practice is intriguing, and we tried to understand why these immigrants were buried all together. At first glance, we thought that there was only one vault, burial vault of immigrants from Lubartov. The funeral company in charge of this grave allowed us to access to a death register held since 1931 and dedicated to the Landsmannschaft of Lubartov. This register was particularly interesting because it recorded reservations for burial vaults owned by the association since the 1930s. It was in this way, but we discovered that there was, in fact, not only one burial vault, but 5 burial vaults belonging to this society. They had been acquired between 1931 and 1986. They are on the slides next behind me. And we decided to take a closer look at the dynamics behind the maintenance of these collective burial vaults over a period of almost a century. This led us to assume that the Landsmannschaft burial vaults were underpinned by moral and economic solidarities. In terms of economic solidarities, the proclamation of the association creation in the official journal of the French Republic dated April 1988 stated that its aim was to help its people in time of need. Among these needs, there were funeral expenses, which were costly for immigrants from mostly working-class backgrounds. First, collective graves enabled Lubatovians to benefit from a place of rest at a lower cost, but also for a longer time. Indeed, four of the five burial vaults acquired by the association are perpetual concessions, which means that they are granting a right to use the land of the cemetery for life. Observation of the naturalization files of the association's first members highlight their precarious position, and by sharing expenses, collective graves were a way to deal with inequalities in deaths. And from another angle, perpetual concessions were also a way to avoid burial in mass graves, which were perceived as socially degrading. To some extent, collective vaults, burial vaults, were also an administrative solution. Debt management was delegated and informations were centralized. Now, let's look at the moral solidarities that accompanies the mortuary practices of Lubatovians. Burial in collective graves express the immigrants' inclusion in a social group, that of immigrants from Lubatov, underlining a link through death to their locality of origin. Thus, it also was a way of expressing the feeling of belonging to a group, even in death. On this topic, the funeral register shows that there were also people buried in the Lubatov's burial vaults who left the Paris region. This was the case of a couple who had lived for most of their life in Reims, next to Paris, and died there. They were nevertheless buried in Bagneux. Therefore, we can assume that being buried with other Lubatovians takes precedence over what might be seen as a norm, the fact that people are generally buried where they lived and or where they died. These moral solidarities are finally given legal expression, especially nowadays, since the members of the Mutual Hate Society are no longer Lubatovians, but descendants of individuals from this commune. These descendants are legally bound to the group, since some of them are owner of the association's burial vault. Indeed, when a vault was acquired by the society, it had to be taken over by one of the members who became the rightful owner. This rightful claimant was responsible for the upkeep and repair of a grave, but above all, for request of exhumation or burial within the association, for which he or she had to give his or her consent. Once the beneficiary had passed away, ownership of a grave was passed to their descendants, who were also members of the association and linked to the commune of their ancestors by this moral bond. This legal issue is becoming more and more important these days, as links between descendants are becoming increasingly tenuous. At some extent, the moral solidarities that underpin the practice of collective burial continue to mark its marks, even with group members who do not longer recognize themselves as such.
In Bagneux, after the Holocaust, new graves were acquired and the existing ones were remodeled. Burials didn't stop during the Second World War. We don't have any cases in our graves, but on this subject we refer to the work of Johanna Lehr, who shows how Jews were buried in occupied Paris. The burial vaults, both the new ones and the old ones, become objects of commemoration of the genocide. For example, the vaults acquired by Les Amis de Lubartov in 1946, which is the second one that the society bought, is also a tombstone in memory of the deportees. Over 240 names of victims of the genocide are inscribed on it. The inscription of these names on the funerary stele can be seen as a means of re-establishing an order of death disrupted by by the Shoah, and to make up for the absence of bodies, murdered deportees are symbolically reunited with the other Lubatovians buried in the vault, but they remain cruelly separated from them in order to avoid any confusion between ordinary death and administrative death, between the presence of bodies on the one hand and the total destruction of the traces of death on the other. One member of the association, Isidor Greenberg, a communist who was killed by the Nazis, is on the vertical side of the grave, not on the horizontal with deportees. Also, he was also a victim from Nazi administration. Being buried alongside this marble list is also a political act of claiming his membership of a victims group. And cemeteries are indeed the primary spaces for commemoration and the gathering of knowledge on the trajectories of deportees. This raised question about the chronology that has long prevailed within the historiography of the memory of the Shoah, which presents the period from the liberation to the 70s as a memorial hollow before the reawakening of memory. And we refer here to Simon Perego works on the maintenance of the memory of the Jewish community in the post-war period. He has a whole article on this metaphor of the awakening of memory and what it implies, a consent by Jews to the prevailing silence. There are breaks in the marble list, like letter breaks in the alphabet, suggesting that additions were made after the construction. And this raises the fascinating question of how this list of victims were compiled, the question of the certification of death and its temporality. Here you can notice that it is extremely rapid and early, from 1946, and when, by whom, and how were the Lubatovians certain that theirs would not return. And we can expect that this speed can only be explained by the fact that Landschaft is mobilizing a social and associative network that pre-excited the Shoah. And the circulation of knowledge is a major historiographical question for those who study this period, who know what, when, and how. And in one of our sources, the memory book, it is a kind of book published after the war, were made up of several texts and photos, like a collage with texts evoking memories of the Polish town, life before the war, but also presenting testimonies of the war and list of deportees. And the name on the list don't match those on our grave, but it is really interesting to compare these two lists on marble and on paper to make a cross-checking. And probably the Lubatovians who drew up the list in the memory book are not the same people who drew up the list engraved. It also refers to who is considered Lubatovian, who do we include in our missing, are only the deportees from France included, or those wound up in Lubartov? Different logics were at work. Another example of this list is another Landschaft. We met the current president, and he showed up this list made on a piece of cloth, calico. And clearly, there are two aspects here, commemorating and documenting examination. And graves are a good way to contribute to the history of the collection of traces of the Shoah. And these collections differ because they are not based on the same sources to certify death. And yes, counting the death seems to have to be a central activity for Landmannschaften in the immediate post-war period.
These trajectories of persecution also modify the layout of the graves. They explain why certain natives with no apparent link with Lubartov are buried with the members, since their whole family was exterminated, making it impossible for them to have a family grave. The commemorating function of the burial vaults is reflected in practices such as the annual ceremony organized in Bagneux, which is one of the only remaining activity of the association nowadays. On the slide on my back, we can see a photograph from the 50s showing several fraternal aid societies, including our Society of Les Amis de Loubartov, who is reunited. This ceremony is a major ritualized moment, and the participants would pay their respect at each of the burial vaults of the Landsmannschaft to which they belong to. At the same time, they were reading out the names of the deceased, and this may be done by members of the association or by a rabbi. Burial rituals for those lost in the Holocaust were also made, prayers or reading of the names of those who were never returned. In short, the collective burial vaults commemorate and document the genocide and persecution experienced by members of the Les Amis de Loubartov. Finally, we're going to briefly show you how collective burial grounds are a good subject for studying how death brings social and family affiliation into play before, when, and after death occurs. Collective burial is the object of collective negotiation within families, between couples, between parents and children, between brothers and sisters. For instance, the choice of burial site is a subject of debate within couple. The example of Yvonne, whom we met in April 2022, relates the painful concessions she made in the marital sphere. Most members of her family are buried in the graves of the Landsmannschaft. But Yvonne will be buried in her in-laws' family grave, away from her whole family. She is very emotional when she talks about the subject in interview, and her case illustrates the deviations from gender and social norms that Landsmannschaft's burial vault can represent. This gender logic can also be observed in the grouping of a few wives, not originally from Loubartov, with her husband in the graves of the society. The study of the negotiation involved in the choice of collective burial therefore highlights the fact that burying oneself with other natives does not mean burying oneself with just anyone. The mobilization of ties outside the kinship recognized as legitimate, the Landsmannschaft, does not prevent people from forming a family or couple in collective graves.
And after the death of individuals, the question of the ultimate group to which they belong still arises. This is what we will demonstrate with the examples of exhumation. The register of funeral directors lists 5. Of all them were women, which raises question about the gender logic of the circulation of bodies. And exhumation are often justified by burials in family vaults, sometimes only a few months after the death, but sometimes many years later. There is also the case of a Loubartov woman exhumed from the collective vault to be buried in another collective vault with her husband. And this expresses that here marital ties are stronger than societal ties, and that even if a person agrees to be buried with other, in the end the family still feels that it is important to recouple post-mortem in the collective burial plot. And briefly, close observation of the funerary epitaph reveals different non-standardized ways of presenting the disease. There were references to family ties in the epitaph, as the family wanted to reaffirm their own ties to the disease behind the collective voice. The name of 4 women are preceded by the words widow, a reminder of the significance of the social status even in death. And the ornaments underline the social status of certain members of a society. A Star of David surmounts the matseva of 2 of the graves, and the name and the photographs of 2 presidents of the Landsmannschaft are inscribed there, consecrating the position of these 2 men within the group. And funerary names are also interesting to observe what spelling will be used. In our various sources, we can see that there are often a host of possible spellings, names that immigrants choose use when they are naturalized, names that are assigned to them or imposed to them, names transformed by the various French authorities who register them and mispronounced their names, which are sometimes reappropriated by the Lubartovians themselves. And the funeral writings bear the mark of this interaction, the face-to-face between migrants and administration. And the director of a funeral company explains, for example, that requests for rectification are common because the engraver writes wrongly a name or because descendants wish to change the surname they feel does not correspond to their grandparents' real names. We have been quick here, but that initiation in death are another way of questioning how social belonging of the deceased and their family, migratory and marital affiliation are worked on.
To put it in a nutshell, our study of the Friends of Lobatov collective burial plots in the Bagneux Cemetery highlights the different ties that come into play when death occurs in the land of migration. Our study also shows how urban investigation and ethnographic survey can be combined with more traditional materials such as private and public archives to shed light on the social ties forged between immigrants around the ultimate social stage of death. Lastly, we think it might be relevant to extend the reflection presented this morning to other examples of mortuary practices of fraternal benefit societies in other countries from a transnational perspective. For instance, the Lubatovians also had developed societies in New York, Buenos Aires, and Tel Aviv, in addition to Paris. Thank you for your attention.
So we are now moving to our third speakers and second duo of speakers. Arkadi Zaides from the University of Antwerp, Royal Conservative Antwerp, Ghent University in Belgium, and Christel Stalpaert, is that okay? From Ghent University. Arkadi Zaides works as a choreographer, a curator and researcher. He obtained a master's degree at the AHK Academy of Theatre and Dance in Amsterdam. Since 2021, he is a doctoral researcher in the arts at the University of Antwerp, Royal Conservatoire Antwerp, Ghent University, and Kask School of Arts in Ghent. He is a member of the Corporeal Research Group at the Royal Conservatoire Antwerp and the Research Center SPAM, Studies in Performing Arts and Media at Ghent University. His performances and video installations have been presented at numerous dance and theater festivals, museums and galleries across Europe, North and South America, and Asia. Zaides is a recipient of various awards, among them Prize for Demonstrating Engagement in Human Rights Issues, awarded to him by the Émile Zola Chair for Interdisciplinary Human Rights Dialogue. Christel is Senior Full Professor at the Department of Art History, Musicology and Theatre Studies at Ghent University in Belgium. She is Director of the Research Center SPAM, Studies in Performing Arts and Media, and co-founder of the FWO-funded research network CODA, Cultures of Dance. She was a distinguished visitor at the University of Alberta in Canada in March 2023 and publishes widely in the field in journals such as Performance Research and the Drama Review. She recently published Performance and Post-Humanism with Van Baal and Karman, that was published by Palgrave in 2021. She's currently writing her monograph on hyphenated thinking, performing arts, activating ecological awareness. And the title has disappeared. No, it's here. It's called Spectral Infrastructure Revealed, Counter-Forensic Processes at Necropolis United. Is it on?
Yeah, I think we will just play a video so we can just leave the desktop. I mean, I just want to maybe acknowledge that this genocide hopping that we are doing collectively is not so easy. Like starting from yesterday to today, so there is like a certain emotional charge that I want to acknowledge, that I think we all share, but I think it should be said. Yeah, and yesterday Georgia showed the shipwreck, which is kind of pointed out as the deadliest shipwreck of the current migration ongoing crisis. And I was 4 or 5 years ago, I was in the Venice Biennale and I stumbled upon this ship. Among the exhibitions, it is placed on the kind of on a small bay. It was placed there in the middle of the Art Biennale, next to the coffee place, without any sign. So people were taking break after the very difficult visit in the Venice Biennale, posing themselves in front of this ship without even knowing what it represents. So I think the concern that I have working within the field of performance is actually the audience. Okay, what do we present, and which kind of experiences we present, and how we present, especially when we're talking about, genocide and atrocities that are happening continuously. And I think that in the theater there is this time which has to be taken very seriously of how we can present and create a certain experience that put people who are usually seated, and I'm speaking now from presenting my work mostly in European theaters, where audience already have a certain privilege of accessing these spaces. So I think what we're going to talk about with Christel is a project that, on one hand, tries to address this kind of, I would claim, privileged spectatorship, and on the other hand, how a project can also, step outside of the theater space and to make something. And then also, I would like to acknowledge that there is a lot of links of people who already, we came in touch with through this project. So there is an already existing network with many people here around this project because of the hyphenated somehow thinking and action. So this is maybe a few words to describe. So in the discourse of Free Thought Collective, which is a collective of scholars, different scholars from Goldsmith, spectral infrastructures encapsulate textures, rhythms, atmospheres, invocations, gestures, vernaculars, and affects that introduce disruption within what seems an otherwise efficient organism. This notion is geared towards the ghostly, affective, and fugitive intensities that undergird both infrastructural and quotidian life.
So a spectral infrastructure is then a haunting presence, a truly ghostly haunting presence within an apparently structural organism that runs smoothly. So we would like to propose this spectral infrastructure as a method of thinking through the countless numbers of deaths of migrant persons in Europe, of these people who died on their way for obtaining citizenship in Fortress Europe. So there is this method of forensic architecture, which is building an argument also for individual cases, This is, and we acknowledge that, truly very important, but what we would like to dive into now is to look for an encounter of these two paradigms, and what we're looking into is now these methods and these particular artistic practices that Arkadi also unfolds in the theater of this spectral infrastructure, and how it connects hyphens, how it connects networks, and how we can collaborate in doing what we're doing.
So on October 3rd, 2013, shipwreck that took place off the coast of Lampedusa and could mark the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis, or crisis for refugees, as Gurminder Bamber more accurately calls it, to remove any doubt as to whom is actually suffering. Following the sinking of the ship, and I'm sure most of you know this incident, the Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta granted the 372 migrants and asylum seekers who lost their lives at this catastrophe with Italian citizenship. At the same time, the rescued 155 refugees from the same shipwreck were placed in a detention center with no rights whatsoever. In order to gain right to live in Necropolis, one has to die in an attempt to enter it. Citizenship is granted posthumously to dismembered, decomposing corpses. Everybody else, the others who are still alive but without papers, are kept outside, left to die beyond the entry points. They need to arrive at the gates dead in order to be processed. This is a text delivered by a voice at the start of the performance Necropolis, inspired by the tragic event that occurred off the shores of Lampedusa in 2013. The Necropolis project sets out to reveal a city of the dead, where the milestones are the graves of migrants and asylum seekers who are buried on the shores of Europe. Necropolis could be perceived as a ghostly infrastructure the Free Thought Collective speaks of. The newcomers dying at our doorsteps are the glue, and this is a term that Free Thought Collective uses, a glue that binding us to Europeans together as we cling to our privileges in a so-called promised land.
As a privileged white person in the audience in the theater of what Arkadi just came to describe, as an audience member, I encountered the deceased migrants in a very powerful way. The very same migrants that Europe, or migrant persons, I would say, that Europe tries to desperately keep out of its territory. They haunted, as in a spectral infrastructure, they haunted me, and they constituted an ever-expanding counter-emplacement, a kind of inverted reality of this European utopia that we're so desperately keeping of Fortress Europe. So on the basis of what the dramaturg Igor called death right, these deceased migrant persons and refugees are granted citizenship of Necropolis, the city of the dead. And in the course of the performance of Necropolis, a whole invisible city resurges from the underland. It houses tens of thousands of bodies that are absent, neglected, silenced, invisibilized, drowned, left unaccounted for, buried without proper documentation, and it is expanding constantly. So Necropolis resurges as a Foucauldian heterotopia of neglected bodies that can be imaginatively thought and remembered. So this heterotopian affirmation is not about displaying a non-existent reality. It is about displaying a hidden dimension of reality that can be imagined and that disturbs our superficial or indifferent thoughts. And with every performance, this heterotopic space called Necropolis expands, expands, and expands.
So Necropolis began upon discovering the list of refugee deaths, which Geert will expand upon later today. which is assembled by United for Intercultural Action, a network of hundreds of anti-racist organizations, activists and volunteers. Christina is also a very active member of this network, and the work that is done around this list. So we discovered it when it was published in The Guardian. So actually in the exhibition that you see outside, it's the first poster. It's how we actually discovered it when it was listing 34,361 deaths 6 years later. So now the last updated version of the list lists 60,620 deaths. When reading into it, one could notice that only a very small number, and Gert, you have to confirm, but I think only 1% of the deceased are mentioned by name, leaving the very majority without identifying details. It is incomplete and thousands of bodies are missing. In fact, the real estimation toll of death that we received from the ICRC is at least doubled. And this was said already yesterday. The European jurisdiction established a clear distinction between criminal, natural, and accidental deaths, which determines the way that the bodies are then handled. As the many thousands of deaths that take place at the gates of Europe challenge this taxonomy, the forensic procedures consisting in collecting medical and biological data from the corpses are not carried out properly in most of the cases. Thus, there is no seeking of also their identities, as I mentioned yesterday. The loss of irretrievable information that results from this neglect prevents any future identifications of the victims. When we began to work with the list, we wanted to get closer to individual cases mentioned in it. Through a series of artistic residencies, a protocol was developed. Its aim is to search for the exact locations where bodies of people who lost their life during migration are buried, in order to get in proximity with their remains. Now, we have to remember that this estimation of approximately now 120,000 of people dying at the shores of Europe, and we're talking about the closer shores of Europe. The estimation that there are only 7,000, 8,000 graves that are to be found. So we are talking about more than 100,000 people missing. Our protocol. So actually, you could say that we are searching for the graves of the privileged ones, the ones who had the privilege to have a grave. Our protocol includes extensive search virtually through press, social media, and on location with local coordinators, which are then assigned by the local institutions that invite us with the project. They in turn make links with NGOs, city archives, journalists, cemetery keepers to obtain information about local recorded cases of death of migrants. If the burial ground is identified, we visit the cemetery in order to determine the exact location of the remains. At the grave, available complementary data is collected. In addition, using a smartphone, the searchers geolocalize the exact position of the grave and record a video of the walk from the gate of the cemetery to the grave. All the information is then gathered and added to the project's growing archive.
So from my own privileged positionality within the Art Studies department at Kent University, I'm constantly asking myself as an art historian, how can we address and challenge the persistent relics of the mechanist, imperialistic worldview in our education system? Maybe by creating a spectral infrastructure, by disrupting the seemingly smooth system of knowledge transfer and knowledge production that runs in a hierarchical way. And how do we do that? By sabotaging it from within. I wondered whether I could create spatiality and temporality for these deceased migrant persons to haunt the university infrastructure as well. So together with Arkadi, I implemented the Necropolis project in several workshop sessions of Eva Brem's university-brought elective course, Human Rights, Transdisciplinary Perspectives. We did this in 2021 and 2022. So for the students, this meant rehearsing deep mapping practices for storying migratory border deaths in Europe. And in several workshop sessions, we practiced Arkadi's documentary choreography approach to the contemporary geopolitical reality of migrations. Students from fields as diverse as law, conflict and development studies, performance studies, human rights studies, public administration and management, and communication sciences were engaged in adding to the Necropolis project's growing archive. They were engaged to collect the data, and they too got closer to individual cases mentioned in it. But more importantly, these workshops disrupted the otherwise smooth service of the university as knowledge institution. The spectral infrastructure of Necropolis created ripples of care within the university. The tens and thousands of bodies that were granted access to the city of Necropolis haunted a seemingly efficient academic knowledge system.
In the theater, the seated audience members are invited to collectively move through the city of the dead. A large screen reveals a digital Google Earth representation of the theater where the performance takes place. The journey through Necropolis starts from this location and gradually zooms out from it to discover the closest grave localized. While descending towards the grave, the digital image of the location is cross-faded with the registration of a walk at the actual cemetery towards the localized remains. The spectators seated in the theater space are invited, or if you want, forced, to collectively walk towards a grave which was just freshly geolocalized. Slides reveal the information referring to the grave, including its coordinates, the coordinates, the date of the date of the death of the person who is buried there, the name, if exists, if known, age and country of origin, if known, and the cause of death. Google Earth then zooms back out, taking spectators further away to another point where a different grave is located. While hovering above inland Europe, the audience discover mostly individual graves of identified migrants. These are migrants that pass through the mechanisms which register them, often in order to further control their movement. When reaching to the outskirts of Necropolis, mass graves are discovered where hundreds, mostly anonymous graves, are revealed. And one of the biggest research I did with the help of Georgia in Sicily. I will skip this.
Okay. So superimposing the map of Europe with names and collected data again disrupts the otherwise efficient tool of cartography. Topographic names are revealed as crime scenes. The topographic names of Jabbeke, Merksplas, Votem, Lampedusa, etc. They become more than objective spatial locations on a map. They become vexed stories.
After around 45 minutes of strolling through the different corners of the virtual city of the dead, the instrument of the performance attempts to create is enhanced even further by a quite radical dramaturgical shift. The performers leave the position in front of the computers. One of them rolls on a metal trolley with objects piled onto it. On the table, they dismantle the pile and carefully place sculpted elements that disturbingly resemble human remains. When the table is full, the performers gradually rearrange the objects into something that could resemble a human body. The body parts are not totally fitting each other. Some are missing, some have slightly different color and texture. They do not symbolize a singular body, but a composite of many bodies, the body of bodies. When the figure is complete, they lean over and examine it. The performers are performing a forensic ritual, a procedure that a lot of the bodies of migrants who die at the borders of Europe never have access to. So the theater becomes a place where procedures that are not properly performed in real life are ritualized, and where the migrants' right to have rights to be forensically investigated is advocated. So I will show us a short clip of the performance.
One has to die in citizenship is granted constituency to this member of the Commemoration process. Everybody else, the others who are still alive but without documents, are left outside, left to die beyond the enterprise. They need to arrive at the gates of death in order to be first. By our death right, being all the citizens of the Necropolis, we are faithful guardians for its heritage. Often, as we lounge in the beaches of the Middle Sea, where is bathing in the warm light coming from the sun, behind our sunglasses we are keeping an eye on the sparkling horizon, across which fresh corpses are regularly being flown. About the others, those who remain alive outside, we know nothing.
So maybe just to finish, since the project has been going on, our cooperation with United has somehow strengthened. As we started, while doing our research, we started to find missing information in the list. So actually, during our local research, we noticed that we start to gather information which is not yet included in the list, and this I could say developed into a collaboration where we continuously, based on our local research, provide information to United. So inside the project, we visited more than 1,000 graves until now, and we provided more than information about more than 150 cases, also to complement the work of Gert and around the list, and this cooperation developed even further now into a university project which we established together with Christel and other partners, including migrants communities in Brussels, data scientists, in order to think how a virtual space can become a place of commemoration.
Mm-hmm. So in 2022, there was a next step that Arkadi and I took together, moving again inside and outside that university as a kind of sabotaging the smooth system. It was the development of this hyphenated database, which is an online spectral infrastructure as ongoing project commemorating people who have died or disappeared during their migrations. We obtained funding for that. It gathers artists, cartographers, geographers, software developers, performance scholars, philosophers, and activists that seek to develop this commemorating practice. But more importantly, as Arkadi said, the project proceeds and starts from close collaboration with the migration communities themselves. So a very important challenge is not only the alignment of different modes of knowledge production in this interdisciplinary research team, hyphenating art, science, and activism. But the main challenge for us is to entail a flexible, transparent, and non-extractive data collection protocol. So non-extractive means that we are not imposing a data development or architecture design on a so-called target group, but that we organize multiple encounters, sitting together with several communities and ask them, what can we do for you? Maybe we then just finish by saying that this could be called a confluence for communities of knowledge, and that we hope that in the connecting hyphens, more knowledge researchers activating what Ariella Azoulay called a co-citizenship, not based on a kind of division of people in people who do have the papers and who do have not, but by creating a citizenship in a mutual concern for the basic rights for people to be buried and to be able to develop themselves from their intrinsic qualities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we now move on to the Q&A session. Are there any questions in the audience? Yumna?
Do you hear me?
But we're recording, so...
Thank you all, Alan, Arkadi, Christel, Louise, and Inès. I have several questions. I'll try to be short. I'll start with Arkadi and Christel. 2 questions. The first question, I'm very much interested by the use of the term the promised land for Arkadi in this context in Europe, because usually the promised land refers to Israel. I find it original and amazing. I would love if you could elaborate on this. The second question is, when we talk about the necropolis, the city of the dead, could we see it as a project granting, I'm not call it the dead body, I'm gonna call it the body of the dead, agency. So it's the body of the dead who decides whether I wanna become a citizen of the necropolis and get buried into it, or I have nobody and I don't want to become a citizen of it. So you give this project, the necropolis might give an agency to the body of the dead. The questions for Inès and Louise. I know very well that your case study is Paris, but I am wondering whether you try to compare with Marseille, especially that Marseille is the second city, the second biggest Jewish community in France after Paris. And when we talk about Paris and la région parisienne, the region of Paris, we talk about carré juif, about the square of the Jewish, while when we go to Marseille, we have the Jewish cemetery. So that's one question. The second question is, when you look at the inscription of the tombs, there is the Hebrew part and there is the French part. And based on the typography I just looked, the Hebrew part is not exactly translation of the French part, if you have thought about the inscription and the typography. Thank you, and I'm sorry for being so long.
Thank you, Yumna.
We'll go in order. The promised land. Well, I think I'm a bit inspired by, again, Ariella Azoulay, perhaps in the way she a bit plays with different terms and where and in which context they are used. Specifically, I'm thinking about one of her articles where she is defining the migration, the migration, the migrants that are coming to Europe as exodus, coming back, and coming back towards where their, the artifacts of their culture is musified. So basically, she does this turn I think in this kind of simple and not simple twist of directionality, she acknowledges a huge history. where the histories, the artifacts, the crafts of these people are here, and they are coming to claim them back somehow. So I think it's a kind of a play of where is our the remains of our cultures are we're coming back there, and as such maybe it could be perceived as a promised land, where we can be united with our stolen goods. Yeah, I don't know. We should elaborate on this, but this is about Necropolis. There is these are very long discussions with Igor Dobricic, the dramaturg of the work. We created, based on the case of Lampedusa, of the shipwreck in 2013. We actually started to provoke ourselves that we are living dead, all of us, in Europe. Having the history of the violence that this territory is, performed over mass-scale territories, and being, preserving their privileges on this territory. It was a provocation because of that same case of Lampedusa, of who is granted citizenship. It's the dead. It's not the living. So we kind of provoked our thinking process, as the dead are welcoming other dead. But of course, it's. The choreographer Ligia Lewis has a project that is called Deader Than Dead. So even in death, we have privileges, and of course, as we know, looking at the fact that forensic investigation is not granted to bodies of migrants. They could be granted as deader than dead, so their bodies are less matter than the dead bodies of Europeans, and the living bodies of living dead.
I want to interweave with these thoughts in the sense of the agency of the bodies that you were talking about, and I think it's exactly that we're trying to do with this project. Next to Ariella Azoulay, there is another philosopher that is quoted a lot during our meetings. That's Vinciane Desprez. And Vinciane Desprez, she's a French philosopher, and she has written this book on our Grateful Dead. So rather than in the project, rather than building a solid platform or an architecture that builds on arguments, we're trying to weave together knowledge, but to create hyphens, but mostly to create space and time. For example, within the knowledge infrastructure of our university, everything has to be very fast. You have to produce A1 articles, etc., etc. So how to provide time for thoughts to allow to take place, and how to create time to share that knowledge. For that you have money, and we just hijack the system for that. So we are paying now also sans-papiers. They are being paid for what they're doing in those multilingual encounters. So that's a kind of creating space for the communities that are also invisible in our system. But we're also trying to create space and time to mourn the deceased migrants and to let them haunt us. So just to quote from Vinciane Desprez, she says the dead have to be situated in a very concrete fashion. They have to be assigned a location from which they can finish what they were made to do. So a place has to be made for them. Then there are more things needed too. It's attention, attending to a body, like the wake, for example. I've heard also that example passing by. Activation, creating a milieu that, if not conductive or welcoming, is at least not hostile. So our main research question is what makes a good milieu for them, for the deceased migrant persons, to finish what they were made to do, and for those who have taken on the responsibility for that accomplishment. And that's the hyphenating all about. It's creating space and time for that.
Thank you for your questions. For the comparison with Marseille, we haven't done it because we were working on the study case of Lobatovians in Paris, and there were Juifs Ashkenaz, and in Marseille they are mostly Juifs Sepharad, and it's not the same mortuary practices. So even for its relevance, in our case, we were mostly working on mortuary practices within the Juif Ashkenaz community in Paris, and we've made a comparison with other Landmannschaften in Paris. For instance, Les Amis de Schliedowlex. We met the president, and we've made some interviews with him. He showed us some archives in order to see how our case was really particular or original, and it was kind of really for us to meet him, because it was really difficult to talk with the members of the Lubatov society, because their society is less and less alive, if I can say it so. And it wasn't the case of the other society we studied in our investigation, but it wasn't the main topic in our investigation. It was a way for having an element of comparison. And for the inscription in Hebrew, we haven't made the comparison because we do not talk and read this language, but within the team we asked a teammate to make the translation for us, and we didn't really use it because we wanted to see how the people were introduced in the language of the land of immigration. You're welcome.
All right. We need to stop, but maybe we can continue over coffee, because otherwise we're going to run late, right? Is it all right? Okay, so we're fine then. I'm sorry, I thought it was 11. So we have a question over there.
Thank you. I have a question for Alan, and thank you for your presentation. It's really fascinating because, not least because it's my own localish history, but I'm interested in the context particularly of a couple of things. One, Bamber Bridge seems to set, an extremely positive example against a much more contemporary backdrop of the hatred and the violence that we've seen expressed against asylum seekers on that same coast, in those same small towns, by essentially the same demographic of people. And I wondered whether, firstly, there was something, because of its collective history and its knowledge of its own collective history, whether Bamber Bridge is now atypical of that kind of seam of almost casual hostility and racism that I sadly see in my own town and upbringing. But the second really was thinking more, you mentioned Jim Crow, you mentioned cotton. This isn't a standalone story about GIs. To what extent is that history also opening up for you the ability to talk about cotton and that whole region's wealth and benefits from slavery, and whether that's assisting in that more general education?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. It's a very, very difficult thing sitting here and talking about this at this moment when 20 miles down the road from me there were gigantic far-right riots against targeting migrants, and I'm very proud of my locality. And I'm very proud of what we do there in an anti-racist manner. And for instance, in my own city of Lancaster, the far right tried to march. They did a desultory little march. They couldn't march because there were 200 of us on the town hall steps. So, but it is a very important question. And one of the things people talk about to me about this is that I'm a romantic. I'm not a romantic. I'm a realist who happens to have come across places in history where there has been transnational and interethnic solidarity. Now, why do these happen in certain moments and not happen in others? It's a very big question. Well, why they happened in the Second World War in that small village is because of a moment of fighting fascism, where working class people were engaged so utterly in that they could not understand an American military force which was promoting racism. And they literally say in interview after interview, they say, we could not understand why we were fighting Hitler and we were being told he was a racist and we were being encouraged to do the same thing. So it's a moment in history, and you only have to look 5 years later to see that when Windrush happens, when you get this new influx of migrants, there's a kind of different reaction. The other reason why there's a different reaction is those migrants are different. They're coming here to stay. The African Americans were guests, and they were mainly going to go home. And actually, one of the problems tend to come when, they're not coming home, and also they're leaving black babies behind. And that tends to kick off resentment and problematics. So this is not a story of the wonders of a non-British racism. I'm very aware and fight against British racism. But I think it's really important to find those moments of solidarity so that we can talk about them as being ways in which we can become better people where we are. The other thing to say about cotton and the profits that made the Industrial Revolution built on the backs of African American slaves. I've written about this extensively. There are moments there of transnational solidarity where the working classes are talking about themselves as being wage slaves and of being united with the chattel slaves against capitalism. And and they don't happen always, and sometimes, it's Frederick Douglass in his visits to Britain in 1845 to 1847 who brings those things to life. And I think that we need to hang on to those moments. And Labaina Himid, in her work Cotton.com, looks back to those moments to talk about the ways in which we can be better people than we became. And I think that's why I look at these moments. And to an extent, the really important thing is not shame, but pride, that these people are fighting racism, these African-American soldiers, and they're encouraged to feel shame because of their because of what happened to them in terms of breaking army discipline. And it's really important that we, in the present time, look upon this as a moment of pride in fighting racism. And in my time of speaking in Bamber Bridge, there are people who keep on trying to kind of take us back and go, oh, well, we have to look at, it's of its time and da-da-da. And you have to just keep saying to those people, oh, so racism is something that we should accept then? And people weren't accepting it then. You know, and it's really important that we kind of like hang on to the fact that racism has always been fought against. It's not a of its time thing. And I think that's one of the many lessons of Bamber Bridge. Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I got a question for you, Inès and Louise, about the money and the circulation of money behind these graves and the burial. And there is always there are these burial funds that are usually. And the members of the community must contribute, but you always have people who refuse to contribute. They don't want. We prefer to go to see an insurance company or bank. They don't want to have to do anything with community stuff. It's not their stuff. So how do they deal with it? Are they ultimately including in these graves, or do they go somewhere else?
Thank you very much. So yes, it's a huge deal for the association currently, because when we met the president, she told us that people were not giving money anymore for the upkeep of the tombs. And sometimes she was only get in touch with the people of the association only when they wanted to have a place have a coffin on one of the tomb. And she told us that it was a mess because they weren't paying for years and years, and as most people of the society are nowadays dead, she cannot really pay for everything. But when we went to the ceremony in October 2022, it was kind of interesting because they were walking in the cemetery, and at a moment she stopped and she told to people that were here, oh, it's really difficult for the society right now, can you give us some money? And people were giving money, even though there were 10 people of the same family, they were all giving 300 euros, for instance, and she was gathering money like this, but it's not really sustainable system, and she doesn't know how to deal with it. Even though she has a lot of money, so she tries to cope with this hardship with her own money, but it's not sustainable at all. So it's a huge issue, I think, for the 20 years that are coming, but mostly for the upkeep of the tombs, because most burial plots are there are too many people in it, and there are not free coffin anymore. So it's mostly for the upkeep, I would say.
Are there more questions? Judith?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the panel. Question for Arkadi and Christel. So you were pointing out that the Necropolis project, I mean, that has been touring, Europe and showing that documentary choreography, in quite a few places. I mean, it's become quite visible, so which is, wonderful. You have pointed out that it was focusing on the privileged ones, the ones who have a grave. So have you been thinking of other ways to push the project, further in order to include in that digital space of a new kind of citizenship, the ones who are not privileged and who do not have those graves.
Yeah, I think this is addressed, I think, by the haunting quality of the project, because yeah, it's a mass disappearance, and I think the project, the artistic work acknowledges that also, not only by giving information, because there is, in the beginning of the performance there is some like very kind of information is given through slides, and actually invites people to engage, invites people to make the search, but also at the I would say the appearance of this ghost that we unleash in the end of the performance, where it's clearly also pointing out to the endless stories which are not that are not assigned a name, and are not assigned a grave. So I think it's more more the experience that the disturbance that the performance kind of proposes by giving, being in proximity with the dead. Yeah.
So it's absence, presence.
Yes, an absent presence. That's also something I would like to add. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important one. Moving from the performance to the performance project, which is called Necropolis United, because we have a very good collaboration with Geert and the List. I think it's also important that collaborating with the communities of migrant people, we also get to know that there is a different urge in society. On the one hand, it's very important to have the list going on, to know, to build that archive of data. But on the other hand, what we're also doing, and what for them is very important, in creating speciality and temporality to be able to mourn not only the privileged ones, but also those who are buried in the ocean, for example, is that we're not building an archive. And in the sense of this spectral infrastructure, we're more what Diane Taylor called constituting a repertoire. And a repertoire it's not ephemeral, it's not located in data or in texts or in something that can be kept as a document in an archive. It's more something that is constituted in ephemeral performativity. It's how to conduct these gestures of care for these bodies. And this is something that is also within this co-citizenship. In every performance, people are rehearsing gestures of care while being invited to doing also this grave location search, to put their mobile phone, put it on the level of their heart and record while they're marching and locating the grave, which is then uploaded for the performance. So you see, it's not only creating an archive, it's at the same time constituting, through this durational performativity, a repertoire of care. So, and this also accounts for all dead migrant bodies, also those who are not located yet. And this will then, in the end, constitute a zone for commemorative practices, which are then more yearly, but then also allowing speciality and time for more individual rituals. So, but yeah, the project is still going on. So this is now what we're working at, this kind of spectral infrastructure.
I would just add that there is also thinking about the impossibility of the project, meaning it cannot be completed because we could not reach all the people who are lost, and so there is a certain depressed ongoingness of the situation that continues to escalate. I mean, we're already 10 years into the so-called migration crisis, where actually the last year was the deadliest. And this is not in the media. It's already kind of out of our radar. So there is this kind of ongoingness of this project also to understand that we have to create forms of engagement around this mass disappearance.
So there's no this haunting process then cannot stop, right?
Well, it can stop only if every person that was lost everybody that was lost will be assigned a name, and this is not. I mean, this is seems mission impossible. But this is a ghost is not like the soul is not quiet until the story is not completed.
All right. Any questions?
Hi, thanks to all the speakers. This is just piggybacking off of Judith's. So this isn't a question; it's more like a comment. In terms, with respect to what Judith asked, I would just say two other theoretical framings that you might want to think about, because I know that you cited Foucault's notion of heterotopia, and so if you're not, I mean, you probably are aware of Membe's notion of necropolitics, but I would also, in thinking about how you might talk about those that aren't privileged, because obviously migratory movements are not. And the theme of this conference to me seems more to be about non-privileged migratory movements than those that are privileged. But if you can get your hands on Etienne Balibar's book, Race, Nation, Class, I think it's chapter 4, in which he talks about the notion of fictive ethnicity. And you might find that to be another interesting framework to read along with your development of the notion of necropolitics. So it's just a little comment. I hope that's... it's Race, Nation, Class, Etienne Balibar. And the key concept is fictive ethnicity. The reason I'm bringing this up is he talks a lot about the unprivileged people that are targeted, through different sort of historical discourses like slavery and colonialism and so on and so forth. And the reason I bring that up is because slavery and colonialism, and also for Alan, your talk, he actually locates the beginning. Membe locates the beginning of necropolitics specifically in the plantation space. So that might be something that is helpful for you too. But anyway, I just thought one way to sort of press that further, to think about the unprivileged, might be through that other concept that Balibar introduces in Race, Nation, Class. So thanks to everyone for your papers.
I think Balibar is also extremely important in what we then also develop in the hyphenated thinking, and then from my perspective from the university, to see how we can unfold it and hijack the system for creating a pluriversity. And in that matter, Balibar is also very, very important. So thank you for bringing him up.
One more question, last question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all the panel presenters. My question is related to the necropolitic performance, because you presented how it's addressing the living and also your university, etc. But I was wondering if the performance was also addressing the dead themselves. Is there also this dimension, or it's only targeted to the living? Is it, as we could call it, a religious dimension in the performance?
There is clearly a ritual that is proposed, and this is the ritual of the search. So I was not thinking about it in religious terms originally, but there is a certain practice that for sure acknowledge a certain community and the search for a certain community, there is a kind of I mean, we were busy with a certain architecture that is emerging, and when you read the list of United, you can very fast your perception of where migrants are dying is very fastly shifting. It's not what we are mostly told about in the media, far away on the shores of the Mediterranean. It's people are dying everywhere. Almost every city you type in, major city, migrants are dying. So this the project more tries to propose a ritual in order to let this spectral infrastructure emerge. If it's religious, for me it became a form of religion, like a form of. I don't think it's a religion, but an obsession. Yeah.
I think where the project, so the research project Necropolis United stands now, we have been working with a lot of multilingual encounters, and just to name the people with whom we collaborate, organizations in Brussels, including Comité des Femmes Sans Papiers, les Voix des Sans-Papiers de Bruxelles, Getting the Voice Out, Agir pour la Paix, Abolish Frontex, Collectif Mort de la Rue, artists, researchers, etc., and of course United. But what is very important also, building on Membe and necropolitics, is that we're not only looking into people, whether they are dead or not dead, but we are looking critically into the system, into our system of when are people declared as death and those protocols. And very interesting there is that where is the border? When is one declared death or not? And then you also talk about missing persons, but also people who are invisible as a citizen in a society that considers citizenship as the beginning of having rights on that territory. All those people, these sans-papiers, or also they call themselves living dead because they are dead to the society, they have no rights. And in that context, for example, we are also trying to hijack systems to point people at how that mechanism is working against living people, but declaring them already dead before they are actually physically dead. And there is a very interesting project now that is growing very slowly through this hyphenated thinking and through this collaboration. Milady Renoir, she's also a very active element within the project. She's an artist, but she's also a facilitator, etc. And she collaborates a lot with Mort de la Rue. And one of the things she's doing is Angle Mort, which is, if you translate it, it's a sticker that is also on the camions which is the that angle. So if you turn around, sometimes you don't see in a particular corner, and sometimes people with a bicycle are hit. And her project that is also now infiltrating in the research project is called That Angle, or Angle Mort. And together with Les Morts de la Rue and Necropolis United, we now are thinking of infiltrating une archive sonore, so a sound archive in Brussels of Bruxelles nous appartient. So you can upload stories there, and we will upload stories about those people who are living in between. So we're not only addressing people in the audience with the project, it's really infiltrating throughout the whole society. So one could say that the project was mainly directed at the audience, but was through the audience infiltrating in society. Within the residencies in the university, it was aiming at the students, but through the students being inspired of doing master dissertations and becoming a lawyer themselves later, being inspired by this, infiltrating society. And now with the project itself, we're like looking for hyphens with existing companies such as Mort de la Rue, etc., to hijack archives and to look at the death angles in society of the death right of people and those elements. Yeah.
Thank you very much.